Slide 1. I welcome all the participants to the online learning platform at Department of Civil Engineering, BMS Institute of Technology and Management. Slide 2. I am Dr. Rajesh Gopinath, and today we shall be discussing with respect to the subject environmental protection and management. Slide 3. In today's presentation, we shall be understanding the concept of environmental standards. Slide 4. We shall first have a brief introduction about this. Further, we shall discuss the various types of environmental standards. Then we shall move on to its advantages, disadvantages, before we summarize it. And finally, I shall be listing the references which each one of you can follow up to enhance your knowledge. Slide 5. So friends, before we understand what an environmental standard is, we need to first understand the concept of standard itself. Let me give you an example. Let us say, for instance, the standard for sulfates in drinking water is 200 milligram per liter. It means that as long as the concentration of sulfate in your drinking water is below 200 milligram per liter, the individual or the human being or the living organism or the earthling which consumes this water will remain safe or healthy. However, if the water contains more than 200 milligram per liter, then it will have adverse impacts on the health. Depending on what is the concentration, the degree of impact also would vary. Let me give you one more example. Let us take the case of air quality. For instance, if I tell you that the concentration of nitrogen dioxide for a given day, that is 24 hours, should not exceed 80 microgram per meter cube. It means that if the ambient air, that is the air around you, if it contains more than this 80 microgram per meter cube, it is going to have a certain impact on your living system. And this applies to all living creatures. So, my dear friends, I think now we have a basic understanding of what a standard is. In simple words, an environmental standard is that value which tells you that as long as you maintain this particular value in your air or your water, the environment is relatively safe. But how do you arrive at an environmental standard? In order to do so, you need to first understand what a guide is. My dear friends, if we need to understand the concept of guide, there are three possible ways. Let us take an example of a chemical such as chromium. Chromium exists in two forms, hexavalent, trivalent. Hexavalent chromium is known to be carcinogenic. It causes cancer. So how do I go about establishing a standard for hexavalent chromium? That is, how do I go about finding out that particular concentration above which it has an impact on the living beings? There are various ways, as I said you before. The first possible way is what we call as bioassay test. In simple words, we try to simulate the impact of chromium, or for that matter any chemical, on another living organism. For instance, if I have an aquarium and I have, let's say, 50 fishes and I add chromium-6 in varying dosages. Based on the dosages, a study is carried out to understand how the varying dosages impacts the fish behavior. At what dosage does it kill 50% of the fish population? At what dosage does it kill the entire population? At what dosage does it impact its behavior? And we presume that if X concentration of chromium can cause this particular impact to a fish, it would also cause similar impact to a human being. So we are basically talking about laboratory studies, clinical research. So this is one particular way in which you arrive at a guide. You arrive at that particular value beyond which it is going to cause damage or health impact for a human being, a living being, or the environment. The second way is wherein you refer to inventories. You refer to data which has been documented during historical disasters. For instance, let's speak about the Chernobyl disaster or the Bhopal gas tragedy. You know, whenever a disaster has taken place, a tragedy has taken place, there is medical data, there is scientific data which engages researchers in that area. And all that data can serve as a reference. For instance, if during Bhopal gas tragedy, X concentration of methyl isocyanate has been released, and if it has resulted in deaths, then we evolve a guideline stating that beyond so and so much of concentration, MIC is fatal. So, in the second step, or the alternate step to bioassay test, we depend on historical disaster inventories. There is yet another third step in which you can go about determining a guide, and that is your epidemiological studies. That is data which you obtain from hospitals, the medical records. If you visit a hospital, your data is documented by them. You know, they analyze your blood, they analyze your urine sample, they test it for the contaminants or pollutants or any chemicals. So eventually the medical data will correlate that a particular patient who shows so and so symptoms is because of a particular chemical. Now, with the help of this medical data, guide can also be established. So let me recap. There are three ways in which you go about establishing a guide. The first one is bioassay test. The second one is by referring historical disaster inventories. And the third one is wherein you take help of medical records, which is epidemiological studies. The same thing may apply in the case of corona, which is prevalent right now. Okay. Now, once you have the guide, the next step is the standards. Here, eventually you have understood what is that particular limit or threshold or the concentration beyond which it is fatal for health. Hence, you fix the standard. If that is the case, then what is a target? My dear friends, if you can look at the photograph which is in slide 5, I believe you all recognize it's a bullseye. Okay? Now, if I tell you that the yellow color what you see is a target, the red color what you see is a standard. Obviously, it is difficult for an archer to hit the yellow color. Why is it difficult? It requires more perfection, it requires more practice, requires more training. Standard is something which helps you to overcome certain health impacts. But target is what a country decides, and target is always going to be tougher or more strict in terms of a standard. Let me give you a simple example to understand this. If I say the standard for a chemical is X, it means that as long as you have a value of a particular pollutant below X or just X, you are safe. That's a standard. But countries, nations, what they do is they fix a certain target which they expect the environment to have, which they expect the humans to be exposed to. Let us say X by 4. Obviously, X by 4 is also safe. But country to country, the targets vary. Let's move on. Once you have the guidelines, you fix the standard. Once you have a standard, then you decide the target. But how do you decide the target? The decision on fixing the target is based on certain factors, criterias, like how feasible is it? How necessary is it? Is it implementable? Can we enforce this? And can I use this as a legal tool? Eventually, based on these criterias, the standards, or let me say targets, are fixed. Now, when it comes to your standards, it can be classified as quantitative or qualitative. Slide 6. Let's look at one particular example of standards. So what you see here is a drinking water standard. So in this table, you can see the first column speaks about parameters: pH, turbidity, TDS, total hardness, sulfates, magnesium, nitrates, and so forth. And then in the second column, you see the standards, okay, which means this is the safety limit. But however, if you look at the third column, you see a parameter, you see values which are more than the standards. So my dear friends, you need to understand here that permissible values was actually the standards, and what you see as standard values is actually the target. Let's move further. Slide 7. If you remember, in slide 5, I told you that we have something called as quantitative standards and qualitative standards. What you saw previously in drinking water quality, it is qualitative standards, wherein you refer to individual pollutants. Now, if you look at slide 7, it speaks about fresh water classification. This standard divides your water bodies into different categories like A, B, C, D, E. Obviously, A is the best quality of water, wherein it is useful for drinking. B is not as great as A, okay, but definitely better than C, D, and E. Now, if you look at the quality of A, B, C, D, E, you can see in third column that individual pollutants and their restrictions are mentioned. So qualitative standards on overall gives rise to quantitative standards. Let's look at slide 8. Here you can see effluent disposal standards. To explain you in simple words, if I take the example of suspended solids, that is serial number 2. This table tells you that the quantity of suspended solids in milligram per liter should not exceed 100, 600, 200 if you dispose a treated wastewater into a surface water, into a sewer and a land respectively. Therefore, suspended solids beyond these prescribed limits, if disposed onto the surface water, which can be a lake or a river, okay, or a public sewer system or an agricultural land, can have its own variable adverse impacts. And definitely the impacts vary based on the capacity or potential. or the sensitivity of the receiving body. Let's look at slide number 9. If you look at slide number 9, serial number 33 speaks about pesticides, wherein you see that all the values are same. It says absent. Hence, it is understood that all parameters do not have the same value every time. It all depends on the potential impact, the significance of that particular parameter or that pollutant. Hence, a lot of factors are considered when you decide a target and a standard. Let's understand better. Let's go to slide 10. This speaks about air quality standards. We had taken a similar example as in the beginning. Okay. Here, you can say that the value of the pollutant, that is the standard, varies with respect to the exposure, with respect to 1 hour, 24 hours, 8 hours, or 365 days. In the same manner, it is variable from parameter to parameter. It is also changing from type of locality and the type of land use. Let's look at slide 11. This gives you a better understanding of what I'm trying to explain. Slide 11 speaks about noise standards. As you can see here, from daytime to nighttime, the noise standards change. And also depending on what kind of territory or habitat or land use, it also varies. All these have to be considered whenever you go about fixing a target. Now let's try to understand the advantages. Let's come to slide 12. Definitely, having a standard, having a target, having a guideline obviously helps you to take decisions which can control pollution. They are definitely the guidelines for you to understand how to prevent pollution. And since your standards are constantly revised, your targets are constantly revised, the quality of environment only improves. However, there are certain disadvantages as well. Let's look at slide 13. We are all aware that to arrive at a standard, you depend on guides. If these guides are improper or not credible, then you arrive at a wrong output, wrong outcome, wrong result. Your standard is wrong. Obviously, your target is also wrong. Hence, it's very important that the scientific data, the information that you are utilizing, it could be a medical record, it could be an inventory from a disaster, all these should be credible. They should be reliable. And the research which has gone into these also should be updated. See, diseases are constantly evolving. Viruses are constantly evolving. Our technology, our research also must constantly evolve. And if this doesn't happen, then the concept of standards will fall flat. Okay? Let's move further. One more particular disadvantage can be visualized from slide 14 onwards. You know, drinking water quality standard in India with respect to pH is 6.5 to 8.5. But if you go to US, it is 6 to 9. What I'm trying to express here is from country to country, nation to nation, the standards change. The degree of variation may not be very high, but yes, it is still not a standardized value. This is one more area of concern and interest. And obviously, when I say that, this degree of variation is only because the targets are different. Let us understand this better with slide 15. It's a very simple comparative representation which can startle anybody. If you look at FEPA standards and WHO standards, you can see that for pH, it's slightly similar. But if you go for total dissolved solids, there's a huge gap. Okay? There are certain parameters such as total hardness or conductivity or sodium for which there are no standards in place. So this is the concern that we are talking about. This is the disadvantage that we are talking about. Let's move further. Slide 16. This speaks about emission standards. From 16 to 17, I will show you how standards vary from continent to continent. So if you're speaking about Euro standards, which is acceptable and applied to the European Union, you go to slide number 17, which speaks about Philippines. So what are emission standards? Very simple. How much of pollutant can you allow to be released from the emission of your vehicles? So this is also not same from country to country. I'm trying to stress that standardization is not in practice. And this is all because targets do not have a norm. It depends on the criterias. And these criterias are at the liberty of the policymakers, the lawmakers, decision makers from one nation to another. Okay? Let's understand this better. Slide 18. Noise standards. I am representing silent zone, and you see that though it is same for daytime, it is different for night time. Okay? So if you look at industrial area, it is same for daytime, but it is different for night time. So probably in certain countries, they are more relaxed or they are more strict when it comes to noise. Friends, I hope you have understood the context of environmental standards. Let's summarize. Slide 19. So what are environmental standards? These are administrative regulations. These are laws. And these are in place for the protection of the environment. And why should it be in place? So that the ecology and nature can be protected from the constant damages of human activities. Of course, there is no concept in place which speaks about uniform definitions. It is varying from country to country. However, any standard for that matter in a given country is part of its legislation, and therefore it is legally binding upon the residents of that nation. You are very much aware that to arrive at standards, you need to have guidelines. Standard, when fixed by authorities, becomes targets. And to convert your standard into a target, you need to consider varying factors like economy, technology, society, politics, and the culture. Followed, I would request each of you to go through these references. Please go through these references to improve your knowledge, enhance your knowledge beyond the restriction of these 20 slides. Slide 21. I'm Dr. Rajesh Gopinath. I would like to thank one and all for being patient for today's session. Thank you. Godspeed. Have a great